Prince Harry returned to British territory in the middle of the night without any fanfare or prior notice. Not a motorcade, no Meghan, no justification. However, it wasn't simply the man who had changed. Hours before he arrived, rumors circulated around Windsor about a revelation so devastating that not even exile could keep him safe. Why now? And why by yourself? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Who didn't meet him at Heathrow's private terminal was the question. Meghan had vanished from view. No photographers, no reporters, no royal protection. Only Prince Harry, entering the rear of a car that has been covertly tagged and is registered under a different name. It was unnervingly quiet. However, the palace itself was taken by surprise, not just the press. 90 minutes prior to Harry's arrival, the alert was sent to Clarence House. Charles didn't even have time to draft a statement. There was no visit here. It was a reckoning. There was no royal convoy in the car that picked Harry up. It was part of a fleet often used for Princess Catherine's own charity endeavors. According to sources, Catherine, not Buckingham or Charles, approved the transportation. Had she been warned? Muttered insiders. Had she anticipated what was about to happen long before the others? Regardless of her intentions, the gesture was clear. Even while facing conflict, one must maintain one's dignity. The royal staff was a mess by the time Harry's feet struck Clarence House's gravel. There had been no protocol activated. There had been no consultation through proper procedures. There was neither a pre-approved schedule nor a press embargo. The fifth in line for the throne had essentially returned as a renegade rather than as a member of the royal family. Nevertheless, the palace opened its doors because the next big thing was too important to ignore. The first conflict to occur in almost 5 years took place indoors, behind doors adorned with decades of history. However, this was not a son's return. It was a summons. Harry had not come to make amends. He arrived to make a demand of the organization as a whole, not simply Charles. Harry set a sealed folder on the table with legal assistance, one that held a fact he felt had been withheld from him for too long, one that carried accusations and one that called into doubt allegiances. This was not the same man who used to conduct light-hearted interviews next to his brother or laugh from the balconies of palaces. This was a man unaffected by titles, equipped with documents, and hardened by seclusion. Once brimming with family privilege and power, the air inside Clarence House now hummed with a new force: anger. He made no request for tea. He didn't give his dad a hug. He started reading that folder, line by line, and one phrase kept coming up while aides stood nervously outside. The truth is what I want. And right now, I want it. Nobody anticipated this. Not Charles, not Catherine, not even William. Because this time Harry was revealing what he thought had been planned all along, not merely pointing the finger at the system. However, there is a secret hidden in Meghan's present, rather than in the past, that underlies Harry's abrupt reappearance. One that wasn't a tabloid rumor or unfounded gossip. One that was so explosive that it rocked the foundation of royal quiet. Harry's return was prompted by a sealed, confidentially marked document that was given to his private counsel before getting married. It had nothing to do with royalty. It had to do with lying, concerning a person Harry believed he knew, as well as what he read broke him. On a calm Tuesday afternoon in Montecito, the document arrived, hand-delivered, bearing international legal insignia, and without any commentary or warning. Harry discovered a number of emails, details of financial transactions, and a thorough description of a relationship Meghan had never revealed. Not to her friends, not to the media, and, most tragically, not to him. Harry understood enough to fill in the blanks, even though the man in issue was only mentioned by redacted titles and legal pseudonyms in the file. This was not a holdover from Meghan's far-off past, According to these records, this friendship continued throughout the months that Harry and Meghan's courtship started to take shape. He was astounded not just by the timing, but also by the trail. Secret correspondence indicating financial arrangements, promises of silence, and ultimately a compensation were exchanged between Meghan's legal advisor and a person now identified as her former associate. Harry was more shaken by the final installment, a single wire transfer, than by anything he had ever experienced inside or outside the royal walls. Had she concealed herself from him by the time Harry addressed his legal team, even though he had left the institution to protect her? Additional information has emerged, including a private settlement made in accordance with the secrecy provisions of the U.S. Civil Code that is currently being subtly contested in court for alleged violation of contract. Already the echoes of this forgotten chapter were edging perilously near the news headlines. In an effort to prevent such disclosures, Meghan's attorneys hurriedly filed emergency papers in California courts to protect her private information. However, it was too late. The paper trail had reached Paula's hands after traveling across the Atlantic. Harry turned to his father instead of Meghan as he felt the floor disappear under him. Not in the role of a monarch. He didn't inquire about titles or succession because he was a man. He posed a single query. Were you aware? Sources close to the confrontation claim that Charles initially responded with a long, jarring silence rather than words. Harry understood the solution right then and there. The Crown had never told him, but its silence had shielded him. A defense that now seemed less like a barrier and more like a betrayal. During the conversation, Harry allegedly lost his temper and accused the organization of planning not only a campaign against Meghan, but also a controlled silence about her. As long as it kept the peace, it serviced the palace. Now, though, it had ruined everything. What started off as a cross-continental affair had turned into something more sinister, withholding realities, a palace, a prince, and a spouse drown under their own weight. However, this was just the start, because the confrontation became an institutional crisis after Charles's next revelation. Certain truths are suppressed when a parent ascends to the throne, not for defense, but for preservation. Finally, King Charles lowered the veil in the Clarence House drawing room. There was no anger in his statements. They were measured, incredibly accurate. I was aware. Oh, he said, and the ensuing quiet reverberated through generations of custom. There was only that one admission, no interruptions, no justifications. Charles was aware. Like other prospective royal entrants, intelligence had reached his desk through various sources well before the royal wedding and the world's celebration of a new duchess. Meghan underwent extensive screening, examination, and observation. Concerns were voiced, even though no unlawful activity had been reported. Financial issues, public connections with undisclosed high-profile individuals, and a past that, according to the internal analysis, came with hazards rather than disqualifications. As expected, the monarchy remained silent. That stillness was protection to Charles. It was betrayal to Harry. The younger prince's poise broke as the monarch described the choice to allow the wedding to take place with no publicity and to allow Harry to wed with his eyes closed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he shouted, his already trembling voice breaking. Calm but uncompromising, Charles answered with a principle rather than an apology, because panic is too costly for the crown. Discomfort was outweighed by stability. "Harry, you were safe with us." The moment broke like glass, and at a huge price. Harry's wound went beyond the fact that he had been kept in the dark about his wife's past. The monarchy had been aware of it and had let it fester and persist until it resurfaced in the form of legal documents and murmurs that traveled continents. He accused his father of manipulating him and using him as a pawn in a public relations campaign that prioritized appearances over emotional veracity. He yelled, "You knew what she was walking into." And since the pictures would appear excellent, you said nothing. Charles didn't speak louder. He refrained from arguing. He just spoke in the words that will go down in history. You requested the truth. You didn't beg for forgiveness. It wasn't harsh. It was clinical. The monarch is not attempting to console his son. Rather, he is speaking as the institution's protector. The line marked the separation of crown and blood between the state and the family. Harry lost all hope of recovering something personal from this intensely political apparatus at that same moment. Harry had returned to a palace where mercy was a myth, and truth was money for a man who had left the royal flock in pursuit of freedom. Charles did not compromise, even though he did break his quiet. He made it painfully obvious that the monarchy is answerable to function rather than sentiment. However, if Charles's betrayal was profound, the subsequent events would obliterate any remaining sense of fraternity between Harry and William. It should have been a family. Duty, tests of fraternity established by loss. William's response, however, wasn't royal. It was uncooked. You allowed her to destroy this family. He lost his temper, while staff rushed to defuse the situation. Meghan wasn't the only focus anymore. It was about devotion, trust, and finally broke boundaries. William had remained silent for years. He observed the publication of memoirs, documentaries, and interviews. He took in all of the charges, character attacks, and rumors regarding his wife. However, the dam finally broke when Harry returned, not to make amends, but with attorneys and threats. It was not the future king who spoke behind closed doors at Kensington Palace. It was the brother who had devoted his entire life to defending a family that was currently under internal attack. Although it wasn't planned, the conflict was unavoidable. William insisted on a one-on-one meeting without any middlemen as soon as Harry left Clarence's house. It was not a conversation that took place. A rupture occurred. William did not inquire as to Harry's reason for returning. He informed him of his destruction. He exposed the repercussions in a trembling voice: compromised security, strained diplomatic relations, and, worst of all, Meghan's latest attempt to gain access to private royal bank accounts following their formal departure. Unauthorized login attempts had been verified by a digital trail that royal tech teams had covertly hidden. The timing and network IP linked to a known associate of Meghan's legal advising circle, notwithstanding the indirect nature of the source. However, that wasn't the worst of it. Then William delivered the last blow, a recording. For proof, not for the media or blackmail. A podcast host from the United States, who is well known for his controversial royal commentary, had played audio snippets of what were clearly Catherine's private thoughts, intended for a friend. Quite intimate. These texts had been leaked, and once more, someone in Meghan's wider social circle was the source of the threat. William had vowed never to mention it to Catherine. Harry had to hear it now, though. She did more than harm the monarchy. William spoke with his teeth gritted. The only person who never retaliated was violated by her. Harry denied any involvement. He accused William of adopting a storyline that was intended to drive a wedge between them and of thinking the worst. William, however, had had enough of faith. He was now acting on evidence rather than trust. "You're more than just a letdown," he said. "To Blood and Crown, you are a traitor." Once unthinkable between brothers, such comments struck with the power of a dynasty in disarray. As the volume of voices increased and exposure threats grew, aides stepped in. Harry was led out. William canceled his planned public appearance, citing a personal family issue. However, the media, always vigilant, sensed that something had changed. The grins had ceased. The practiced motions were no longer there. One woman remained strangely calm and devastatingly silent as the brothers broke their last bond. But the air was no longer holding back. She remained silent. She didn't strike back. Her quiet, however, shouted louder than any scandal Meghan could create. The following morning, the country saw Catherine enter a children's hospice as a symbol rather than a victim. Harry, too? He saw what Meghan would never be, the face selected for the crown. Catherine adhered to her plan without making any visible deviations, even while headlines raged and conjecture swirled on social media. Although her appointment at the hospice had been scheduled weeks in advance, the timing felt like a statement, subtle, purposeful, and filled with quiet resolve. She was dressed in deep navy, a brooch that has long been connected to Queen Elizabeth, and an unwavering calmness. Sidelong looks were absent, not a word about Harry, not to mention the accusations that are circling the world press. It was the epitome of poised authority without resorting to defensiveness. In the face of flames, remain composed. However, Catherine's position behind closed doors was not visible to the public. She wasn't trying to hide. She was getting by. Catherine took the initiative to adjust the monarchy's media stance during strategy discussions with communications directors and senior officials. Instead of using combative language, use contrast. She opted for presence as the rest of the family struggled with conflict. Catherine provided stability as Harry controlled his emotions. She never once sought compassion during it all since. By remaining silent, she had already taken control of the story. However, there were unanticipated threats to that story. Catherine's name was used in a pitch for a U.S.-based tell-all project that was allegedly supported by a streaming behemoth, according to an internal studio memo that was leaked and acquired by a London-based investigative organization. The memo's description of her as the passive force that wrecked Meghan infuriated royal servants and widened the divide between the two factions. Insiders verified that the idea originated from a production crew in California that has close connections to Meghan's old media advisor. The leak was explosive, and the palace knew exactly where it came from, even though the idea was never approved. Catherine, however, remained on the same path despite the confusion. According to insiders, her resolve was based on responsibility rather than pride. She had witnessed the disintegration of the monarchy due to the despair of individuals who felt invisible next to her, not just scandal. Meghan had no intention of becoming Catherine. She had desired to overshadow her. And when that failed, resentment increased because just by existing, Catherine had reminded the world of what the monarchy wanted in its future queen: self-control, stoicism, and a power that didn't need a microphone. An unanticipated groundswell was the outcome. Women in the UK started using the hashtag #Windsor Women to convey messages of solidarity. Timelines were inundated with posts from moms, teachers, nurses, diplomats, and other women who saw in Catherine not only royalty, but also introspection, dignity when under duress. The power of silence. It wasn't planned. It was natural. And it was the point at which Catherine stopped existing. Only a member of the monarchy. She served as its shield, but while the royal persona grew stronger around Catherine, someone else stood ready to tear it all down from the other side of the globe. Meghan had established a country of her own, one of power, praise, and carefully chosen truth, from red carpets to headlines. However, the script had changed this time. She didn't use quiet as a tactic. It was a matter of survival. And the once enchanted Hollywood was gently shutting the door. The fallout started with quiet rather than a single controversy. Meghan stayed in California while Harry returned to the UK with devastating accusations and growing legal issues around their family. Nothing to say. Nothing, just silence. No denials. However, quiet speaks loudly in Hollywood. Brands that had previously demanded to support the Duchess of Sussex started to back down behind closed doors. Citing internal reevaluations and ethical checks, Sponsorships that had been arranged at seven-figure prices were quietly stopped one by one. The gleam was disappearing. Furthermore, what had once been a media darling was now turning into a liability. Then the unexpected blow came. The Sussex's most potent storytelling vehicle, Netflix, postponed their impending docuseries indefinitely. Creative misalignment, according to insiders. Few, however, accepted the justification. Sources claimed that fear was the true cause, worry that their investment had become a PR catastrophe rather than a cultural moment. The risk of a story breaking down in real time was too great for executives to take. However, Hollywood itself was the source of the greatest public humiliation rather than business boardrooms. Actor Kevin Costner publicly chastised Meghan after she arrived to fanfare at a prominent United Nations banquet in New York. He charged her with using her personal influence to sway royal and humanitarian initiatives. He didn't whisper anything. They were addressed to microphones. He stated she appeared as if she still wore a crown. In an instant, the room changed. Once hailed as a disruptor, Meghan was now perceived as an aimless disruptor. In the meantime, rumors of non-disclosure agreements, which would conceal facts that, if made public, may further shatter Meghan's story, started to spread among former employees. According to a former staffer before Meghan's royal debut, whole chapters of her prior relationships, financial troubles, and private discussions had been painstakingly cleaned up. The palace had remained silent, but now those pieces were starting to emerge in the absence of their defense. Meghan's lawyers acted quickly. American and British tabloids were sent cease and desist letters. However, they encountered opposition this time. The public interest was mentioned by editors. Attorneys resisted. Additionally, Meghan's formerly dependable shield of silence started to break. Contradictions now dominated her brand, which was founded on resiliency and reinvention. Amidst the confusion, a fresh rumor started to spread. According to reports, Meghan was getting ready to publish a solo memoir as a last-ditch effort to take back control of the story and provide her perspective without interference. Critics, however, weren't persuaded. Was this a performance or the real thing? More significantly, would anyone be listening at all? As Hollywood pulled away from Meghan, another storm that had the potential to completely alter royal ancestry was about to blow up in Europe. She was a shadow and a whisper for months, but now she had papers and a name. The monarchy awaited what perhaps be its darkest moment as DL got ready for her televised bombshell, a disclosure that would render two heirs invalid and permanently break the continuity of the royal line. Her identity had been carefully protected, legal documents that just have initials on them. Sources of the leaks were identified as anonymous. Redacted reports and fringe forms mention it. Now, however, DL was entering the light with receipts in hand. She would give a live, uncut speech on January 3rd, 2026, which would be broadcast on television in the US and the UK. Her legal team affirmed that the interview was factual. The Crown itself was the target of this well-planned attack, not simply Harry or Meghan. DL's allegation was both remarkable and sad. She claimed to have been the unidentified surrogate for both Archie and Lilibet, claiming a biological relationship to them. However, this was more than just a personal tale. It included financial records, signed non-disclosure agreements, medical records, and other documents that, if checked, would prove the existence of a plan that was purposefully kept secret from the public and the legal advisors to the monarchy. A damning picture was drawn by offshore trust payments, locked clinic logs, and compensation disputes. If this was the case, they questioned the validity of the succession rights given to the offspring born in such secret. The reaction inside Buckingham Palace was quick and harsh. At King Charles's request, the Lord Chamberlain conducted an urgent legal audit. All post-2018 royal succession documents were retrieved from the vaults. They flew in legal historians. Experts in constitutional law are on call. No time for spinning. The monarchy was trying to survive. This was no longer a scandal. It has to do with legality and ancestry. And the institution was in danger of experiencing an unparalleled constitutional crisis with each minute that went by without clarity. Concurrently, King Charles established the Windsor Continuity Committee, a unique task group. Its goal was straightforward: be ready for anything that might happen. The monarchy would have to reconsider the succession plan and would even have to revoke all of Harry's children's rights and titles if DL's allegations were upheld in court or, worse, in Parliament. Already shattered public trust may break irreparably. Additionally, public polls revealed a troubling shift. If ambiguity persisted, the monarchy ran the possibility of inviting judicial challenges from all throughout the Commonwealth. Over 50% of British respondents asked if the monarchy had the legal fortitude to withstand such a disclosure for the first time in decades. In the meantime, well-known legal experts started to alert people to the terrifying prospect of succession ambiguity. Archie and Lilibet's titles might be revoked, their inheritance rights disputed, and any potential promotion to royal duties declared void in the absence of established legal parenthood. It was more than a challenge to the House of Windsor that DL was getting ready to disclose. Its basic foundation was put to the test. Because the question of a child's true belonging is more than just an emotional one in a monarchy, where legitimacy is determined by heredity. It is existential, and a man caught between survival and loyalty is at the center of this moral and legal storm. He came back to ask questions. He declared war. However, Prince Harry ultimately found himself without allies and surrounded by silence rather than support. History had called into question him, and he now faced a future in which even his children's birthrights were in jeopardy. This was no longer exile. Erasure was the term. Harry vanished into solitude in the days after he helped start the storm. Once, a secluded Norfolk estate was available for privacy. Now operating more like a protective exile, there are no photos or press releases, just silence. Concern in royal circles started to grow, not for the monarchy, but for the man who had previously disobeyed it. Harry's behavior was erratic, unpredictable, and even reclusive, according to those close to the issue. What started out as a ferocious quest for the truth was now degenerating into a personal collapse that was too sensitive to face and too public to ignore. New information was emerging within the palace walls. Insiders' suspicions were validated by leaked text messages. In private, Harry had pleaded with King Charles to step in, should use whatever institutional authority was left to hush DL before she spoke, send out legal teams, apply diplomatic pressure, and prevent her interview from airing. However, Charles declined, hardened by the harm already done. According to one senior official, his remarks were unwaveringly solid. "We won't use fear to rewrite the truth." It was Harry's last rejection by his father and his sovereign. The fallout made its way back to California. Insiders understood that Meghan had suspended 3 high-profile public appearances, claiming that they were due to personal issues. Their home was collapsing. Employees were let go. PR handlers were swapped out. Days were spent on legal briefs. Offense was no longer being played by the Sussexes. They had barricaded. Then followed the administrative strikes, which were calm. Once granted by diplomatic courtesy, security privileges were revoked. Titles that had previously been shielded by goodwill and technicalities were reviewed. Most horrifyingly, inheritance-related internal trust provisions that had been covertly drafted at the time of Archie and Lilibet's births were re-examined. Their financial and legal futures would be in jeopardy if DL's documents were valid. It was a time of reorientation for the organization. It was collapse for Harry. The exact mechanisms he attempted to overthrow were now overshadowing the man who had once stood on international stages and been hailed as a renegade royal with a cause, and he intended to recover the truth, as one royal advisor phrased it coldly. However, he only gave it up. However, when Harry vanished into the haze of scandal, the monarchy readied its most resolute reaction. However, a structural assertion rather than a verbal one. The monarchy does not cry when tradition is at danger. It takes action. The new royal doctrine, which was created from stone rather than emotion, will be unveiled to the public on January 7th. Because the crown never forgets, and this is a constitutional battle, not a family reckoning. The palace had already started writing its last lines, even if the last curtain had not yet dropped. The monarchy had been forced to a breaking point after weeks of turmoil, treachery, and upsetting revelations. Personal retaliation did not ensue. It was a recalibration of the system. After weeks of silence, Prince William came out, determined to become the future king rather than a brother. He started getting ready to give a speech across the country. It was a statement to reaffirm Pillars' responsibility, process, and succession, not to win hearts. There was no end to the monarchy. Consolidation was taking place. The foundation of this answer was DL's documents, which were now verified by legal professionals and considered reliable enough to initiate an official examination of all Windsor inheritance and lineage rules. All of the sealed documents, clauses, and signatures related to the Royal Succession Post 2018 were reopened. The line of succession had evolved into a legal battlefield rather than merely a family tree, and the monarchy was getting ready to use all of its resources to defend its future. Silently yet firmly, the first punches fell. With immediate effect, Meghan and Harry's titles were legally suspended. Operational removals, not merely honorary ones. It was mandated that all Commonwealth organizations and royal charities cut ties, purify their branding, and realign their associations. This was not a short-term situation. It wasn't specific. The Sussexes were now formally outside the system they had previously tried to flee on their own terms, for the first time since they had left. The gates had been firmly shut behind them by the monarchs. They briefed foreign embassies. Official declarations explaining the Sussexes' new position, or lack thereof, within the royal hierarchy were sent from Wellington to Cape Town, from Ottawa to Canberra. It was intended to dissuade Meghan from using the title of Duchess at diplomatic events. All throughout the Commonwealth, protocol officers received clear instructions. They had rebuilt the boundaries between active royal responsibilities and previous royalty, and they would not be blurred. However, diplomatic clarity wasn't the end of it. The ramifications of surrogacy and constitutional inheritance were discreetly but strongly discussed with Parliament. Although there isn't an explicit law prohibiting inheritance from surrogate births in Britain, custom and legal precedent control the royal family, not a sentimental interpretation. The path to the throne might be legally questioned if the woman listed was not the genetic mother, or if the documentation was hidden or insufficient. The Crown was preventing a possible constitutional collapse in addition to handling a scandal. Two individuals who had long represented stability were at the forefront of this silent but powerful reckoning: Princess Anne and Princess Catherine. Already seen as the future monarchy's face, Catherine worked with top advisors to make sure the messaging was succinct, respectable, and impenetrable. Anne was in charge of internal continuity planning and was well liked for her strict commitment to her work. They protected the monarchy from additional damage to its prestige by forming a protective flank around its center, because it was now obvious what the message was. Insults could be forgiven by the Crown. It might withstand criticism. However, it would not put up with anarchy that endangered the foundation of its fundamental structure. One thing is clear: this was never simply about Harry and Meghan. Even as the monarchy draws closer and fortifies its boundaries, this has to do with the Crown's soul, and that soul is retaliating in 2026. I appreciate you watching. Remember to subscribe and like. We'll see you at the following one.